Well, now that the President of the Government of National Unity has been inaugurated, the focus moves to the appointment of the cabinet and the tough job that awaits the 7th administration. To help us unpack this now, I'm joined by Professor Zwelinzima Ndevu. He's with the Stellenbosch University, a director of the School of Public Leadership there. And a little later, we're hoping to be joined by Professor Somadoda Fikeni, chairperson of the Public Service Commission, and political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. Professor Ndevu, let's start with you. We're kicking off this conversation. Our other guests will find us on the way. Let's begin with whether or not President Ramaphosa can afford to keep the country waiting in as far as appointing this cabinet, and keep in mind that the business community also is watching this with a bated breath.
Good evening to you and good evening to your listeners. I think it is important now that the celebratory process has been concluded with the events today, that the president must start with the business of asserting and assessing people that might be right for the new cabinet. So the country, we don't have the luxury of waiting very long. We would remember that all the executive, the ministers, their term of office ended when the president was sworn in. So there is a vacuum or a gap, and the president would not like, or it would not be advisable for president to keep us waiting for a very long time. So unfortunately, he's got a very difficult task to consult in a government of national unity. You don't only consult with your partners in your political party, like your alliance partners, but you have to consult broadly with also the other stakeholders within the government of national unity. I assume that that's a process that the president has started engaging with the partners, and soon, hopefully before the weekend, we will hear who would be the people that the president would appoint.
While we wait for that, do you think that it is going to be entirely up to the president to avoid a waiting game? Because as things stand right now, there appears to be lots of argument about the ANC, firstly, not being the leader of this GNU, at least in the words of Helen Zille from the Democratic Alliance. Second of all, she says that the ANC will obviously have 60%, as she put it, contribution into this cabinet. The Democratic Alliance must occupy 30% of those positions. So you can see the haggling that's already started. So the question is it entirely up to President Ramaphosa, or it's about his style of engagement that is going to hopefully unlock things quicker?
We expected, Toli, that this is not going to be smooth sailing. This is going to be a difficult task for one to do, because you are having a government of national unity that is formed by parties that had different views going to the election campaign. And the result have forced them to work together. The electorate results have forced them together. So I expect, as the president and his political party, which is the ANC, have maneuvered around engaging with different stakeholders to form this government of national unity, to do the same, to maneuver and engage with their different partners and find each other. One is expecting that there would time and again be differences of interpretation of rules, of interpretation of agreements. So this is something that we as South Africans should expect that would happen in the next 5 years if this government holds for 5 years. But I think the president must be matured enough to be proactive, to engage with his colleague starting from tonight or early in the morning, and find each other and maybe have a framework around what the governance will look like. One of the things that he might firstly need to do is talk about the size of the cabinet, whether he is going to reduce, there has been a call for a very long time coming, that the cabinet must be reduced, and this is an opportunity for him to do that. And then look at the skills deficit that he might have in the ruling party, and look at complementing that with the skills capacity in other parties. So it is something that we have to work on, but one expects the ANC to have more cabinet ministers than the DA, and the DA to have more cabinet ministers if IFP does have cabinet ministers, and so forth and so forth.
So you've already prompted then the next topic of discussion, because it's got to do with, many words have been used here to say the reconfiguration of cabinet. Others are saying that it's going to be the reorganizing of this cabinet. I pressed the spokesperson of the ANC last night as to whether we're going to see a small, fit-for-purpose cabinet or a much more expansive one, meaning a much larger cabinet, given the GNU partners. She was non-committal on neither of these, but quite specific to say they've never used the word small and fit for purpose. So given that kind of response, might we expect an enlarged cabinet?
I think ideally we would like to have a much smaller cabinet, a cabinet that is fit for purpose, as you've put it. But typically with negotiations, there are gives and takes. So one of the things that might happen, it might be that the parties don't find each other in the small cabinet in terms of representation and the focus of government, and they prefer a larger cabinet. But this is not ideal. You would remember that for a very long time coming, our economy is not growing. The cabinet, having a big cabinet, also costs a lot of resources. And I don't think that this government would want to use a lot of resources in having ministers and the benefits that they get and so forth and so forth. Because in each cabinet member, that to your point, you must remember that it's not only that individual, but there are about a maximum of 10 to 12 support staff that you have for each minister. So I'm not talking about the ministry itself. So that burden to the fiscal must be avoided at all costs. And I'm hoping that the negotiators will be sensitive to that particular point.
If we move from cabinet ministers and we get to positions such as directors general, and so the hierarchy goes downward, how pensive do you think the mood is there right now, given that there are new political players in the space? It's no longer an ANC government that is going to lead because it doesn't have the majority it previously had. How worried are those people, do you think, are?
I think ordinarily they have to be worried. One, because they are creating new principles. And, you know, when people you have not worked with before, some are hoping to retain their previous principles, but those who will be getting new principles must be worried about that. And the fact that your principal might be from a different political party than the one that the previous principal was from, and that can change the direction of the department, that must also get DGs and head of departments unsettled. But what must be a comfort to them is that there is talk of professionalization of the public service, so they should not be affected that much at face value, at least, or a working relationship with whoever become the political principal. As long as they are competent, they do their work diligently, they are able to deliver as expected. So they should be able to function irrespective of who is the political principal. But I know because of the closer relationship that people have and the differences in political ideology, which should not apply with administrators, but more often than not, we see some of them politically aligned. That might be, you would find that they would be unsettled. But I'm hoping that it will be a smooth transition. We would see instances, I would not be surprised, where instances where there are going to be clashes of opinion, clashes in terms of processes or how people work, and ultimately some of them would get out of the system as a result of that. That is to be expected with any administration.
Yeah, we're joined, Professor Ndevu, by Lukhona Mnguni, a political analyst that South Africans would well know. And so let's welcome him into this conversation. Mr. Mnguni, good evening to you, sir. Welcome to this conversation. We're talking about the cabinet that is anticipated to be announced in the not too distant future. We started off the conversation about whether or not the president has the luxury of time to keep the country guessing, keep the markets guessing, or does he have to do this in the shortest time possible? I'd like your thoughts on that, but also, importantly, the element that Professor Ndevu has just remarked on as to, given that we have a new cabinet now with new political players, or we're going to have a cabinet with new political players, is there going to be resistance to either accepting these new people by the civil servants? And I'm thinking here the very top ones, and that's the Director General, because there does seem to be a lot of clashes between the minister and the DG, and this was still in the ANC-led government. Now we're going to have new players, political players. Might we anticipate even more clashes?
Good evening, Polly, and good evening to Prof and your viewers. Many loaded questions there. I suppose, I mean, I won't say tradition, but it's always been anticipated that following the inauguration, over the weekend, there would be an appointment of cabinet, possibly announced at lunchtime on Sunday. And I am sure that President Ramaphosa might do that if there is indeed a complete, understanding and agreement within various coalition partners about the direction to go. Some coalition partners are asking for him to stay true to his word. You'll remember, actually, in 2018, President Ramaphosa called for a study on the reconfiguration of cabinet, of the executive, which is cabinet, and to a large degree, the Department of Public Service and Administration and the Public Service Commission did work on something that was actually tabled to him. But eventually, again, during another State of the Nation address, he spoke about the need, actually, when he was reshuffling cabinet in August 2022, if I'm not mistaken, or 2021, actually, after the July riot, somewhere there. He spoke about the need that, of course, he's still embarking on this process, and now with Treasury, on the determination of the feasibility of the reconfiguration of cabinet, which reconfiguration is a euphemism to make cabinet smaller. And only one of the things that happened in 2018 is that the number of ministries were reduced, but the departments themselves were not necessarily integrated. So if you look, for example, at what happened with the Department of Higher Education and Training and Science and Technology, is that the ministries were combined, but you actually remained with two director generals, and therefore you had parallel departments. It was even worse for the Department of Agriculture, because it was agriculture, rural development, fisheries that were sort of being now put into one department, but one was still, some segment of it was left with the Ministry of Environmental Affairs. And it created a lot of reporting nightmares for the bureaucracy. So I think there's a serious conversation that we don't only want to look at the reduction of ministries, but we also want to look at the integration of departments so that there's a seamless bureaucracy, without a bureaucracy that is now reporting in multiple directions with different political principles. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
And so therefore, I think that President Ramaphosa may do well to be ready to appoint cabinet. But Polly, if you might have seen the circulating draft parliamentary program, the official opening of this of Parliament is actually pegged for the 18th of July. So some people are saying that that is to give the president enough leeway to continuously negotiate with the partners to the so-called government of national unity. And therefore, by the time he arrives at the State of the Nation address on the 18th of July, there is an agreement on the table. So there's a lot that's in flux. And I don't want, to unnecessarily pressure the conversations. But yes, it may well be good for South Africans, the markets and everyone to be taken out of their anxiety. But it's also important to give the political players enough room for them to actually work out a sensible conversation, a sensible pact amongst themselves, as you would have seen in the statement of intent for the government of national unity. Is that once this has come to fruition, within 6 weeks, the parties to that must actually go on a journey of negotiating the policy platform for the government of national unity, integrating the various manifestos, and then coming up with a priority list for the national turnaround. So that's very important. On the latter part of your question, Oli, it is an important consideration, and we've seen it in municipalities where and it's vice versa, by the way. A political principle can come. I mean, the interesting case is the city of Johannesburg and the fresh produce market, where, you know, a political principle comes into a portfolio and quickly wants to change certain executive roles within a state-owned entity or within an entity of government, because they don't like the people there and they want to put their own lackeys who may well be of service to their demands. On the other hand, you may well find a bureaucrats who are not well versed in the politics of the new political principle, and they actually don't like the political principle because in the first instance, they probably didn't vote for their party, and therefore they want to sabotage them. However, what is probably going to be interesting in the new administration is that you may find that a whole host of new ministries may well ask the president to relieve a number of directors general of their duties so that they can, in consultation with the president, recruit their own directors general, so that they've got trusted accounting officers in their departments that they feel they can work with. Whether that would be with good intentions or bad intentions, time would have to tell on that one. And of course, some departments have massive and significant vacancies, of which, if you talk to some directors general, they'll tell you their frustration is that they don't have powers given to them to fill up certain positions within their own bureaucracy. They've got to wait for the minister. So we've got to see how the new ministers fill up certain vacancies in the roles of deputy directors general, chief directors, and all of that, because it's going to be an interesting time on how do you make sure you've got a bureaucracy underneath you as a political principle that is loyal to your sensibilities of loyalty. But we must also remember that this is a government of national unity, so ministers may not have the ability to act as though they are islands in circumstances of this nature, even if they may so wish.
Yeah. Professor Ndevu, back to you. We are now getting into a new topic altogether. I'd like to talk about the capability of the state, or what some people like to call the professionalizing of the state. The Center for Development Enterprise is quoted in the Business Day today as suggesting that there are what it sees as mission critical posts. And in order for a professional state or a professional government to function optimally, officials who are in these posts that they see as mission critical, they ought to reapply in order that they get people who are competent in those positions. Do you think that this is something that could potentially be welcomed by the new government, or something that could be explored?
Only there are clear gaps in the public service in terms of skills. That there is no doubt about it. I think government in its own research, and when they were finalizing the framework on professionalization of the public service, they've identified that there are a skills gap. But one should remember that in an ideal world, it would have been ideal to do that. But there are laws that governs the public sector, and it is not easy to take people out and say reapply for your positions. I think one of the things we need to do, because we have now identified the skills gap, we know the skills that we need for a 21st century public service. We need to say, how do we ensure that we work with the National School of Government to capacitating the colleagues that are there in those positions where they are incumbents, but in the positions where there are vacancies, the critical positions, we can then be able to recruit the right people. But where there are people, we start first by capacitating them. If we cannot be capacitated, or they go through the process, but they are still not competent, then we think about other means. But I think at this point in time, we should really think about how to utilize the National School of Government effectively to close these skills gap that we have identified. We know that repurposing capacity within the public service can also be abused, can be used for other, other intention. As my colleague has said, if the principal doesn't like someone, he would say, then let's move that person to another space or another department. But I think what we need to do is to really think very thoroughly about it. There are around over 2,000 people that have been identified that do not have the skills that are requisite for the critical positions that they are holding. How do we reskill those people? How do we ensure that our education, higher education sector helps in ensuring that it capacitates these public servants to close those gaps? I think that should be a starting point.
All right, Professor Ndevu, thank you very much. Let's actually take a pause here because we are joined by Professor Somadoda Fikeni. Luckily, he has landed in Port Elizabeth and he is now settled. He's going to join this conversation. He is the chairperson of the Public Service Commission, and these are the people who are actually tasked with this job of professionalizing the state. He's going to give us his views. He's going to join this panel. So let's take a break. When we return, we'll get his views as well. You're watching News at Prime, and we are discussing what is essentially going to be a cabinet that will likely be appointed sometime soon, but also, importantly, how do we turn around the state in order for it to function optimally? And with me for this conversation, we're still joined by Professor Zwelinzima Ndevu. He is with the Stellenbosch University, a director of the School of Public Leadership. We're also joined by Professor Somadoda Fikeni, chairperson of the Public Service Commission, and we are also joined by a political analyst, Lukhona Mnguni. Professor Fikeni, this is perhaps your moment to get a word in on this conversation of professionalizing the state. Is this GNU era the opportune moment to quickly accomplish this mission of professionalizing the state?
There has never been a better time than now because the crisis of corruption, poor service delivery protest, and poor implementation of policies has indicated that we need to press a reset button in capacitating the state. And professionalization framework, in a very important way, does provide such, together with other reforms which are taking place in the public sector. The fact that you do have now the government of national unity or the current permutation of different parties in government provides a moment when all political parties have a sense of vulnerability. At the same time, there is a sense of opportunity to reimagine public service where competence, where capacity becomes the most important thing, and the loyalty being that to the Constitution rather than the ones of focusing on a political party.
Let's come to you, Lukhona Mnguni. There is what is called, and Professor Ndevu already made reference to it, there is what is called the National School of Government. Professor Busani Ngcaweni, I think he is the leader of that School of Government. Do you think they would possibly be receptive to this idea of people reapplying for their posts in order to get the most competent and fit for purpose individuals?
Well, Toli, I mean, the National School of Government has been working very closely with the Public Service Commission in developing this framework around the professionalization of the public service, including an introduction of a number of, modules that one must undertake if they so wish to apply in future to particular positions within the public service. The public service is a massive entity in South Africa, and it probably would be a very cumbersome task to undertake a complete reapplication of roles. But as you would know that in our legislation, it would also trigger certain processes under the Labor Relations Act, as though that people are being restructured in one sense or the other if you have to now go on a process of reapplication. So there are a number of laws and things that must hold constructive tension in our country as we think of this idea. Prof Fikeni knows, and we've had a long conversation around this, and I've continuously alluded that part of what we are actually frustrated with is not necessarily the professionalization of the public sector. If you go to various departments and you look at a number of professionals in the public sector, highly qualified, with degrees and postgraduate degrees in a variety of fields. I mean, if you go, for example, just to a division of water scientists at the Water and Sanitation Department, you find people who are actually globally acclaimed. They present in conferences and all of this. If you go to the Department of Agriculture and you look at food scientists who are there, you find highly competent people with massive specialized research skills and all of that. What I've contended is that we are dealing with a need for the depoliticization of the public sector, where we limit the type of interference that politicians can do on the public service. Because in terms of qualifications, in terms of professional bodies that public servants belong to, you've got engineers in the public service who belong to engineering bodies. You've got chartered accountants who belong to SAICA, and so the list goes on, Polly. So the point here is that we've got to actually be quite honest about what we are dealing with. There is a need in some layers of the public service, and particularly at a municipal level, but that's a story for another day. There is a need in some layers of the public service to ensure that there are professionals who are competent and well qualified for the duties that they need to perform. But there is a need, on the other hand, to remove political interference by political principals who want their political wishes to be turned into government mandates and priorities. I mean, one person once told me that in one province, there was a building of a school, and it was the MEC or the premier who decided the location of the school against the advice of technicians, of civil, or of geological civil engineers who were saying, no, this is not fit for purpose. Yeah. So let's use another location. But the principal had promised that community that a school would be built in that area. So the point I'm trying to say is that we need a constructive tension. Of course, the Public Service Commission and the National School of Government would not want to be seen as playing politics. They would want to be seen as insulating the public service from the machinations of politics. But I think we also need to have a column of voices who are quite clear that part of what we are dealing with here is to say to political principals, they must stop intimidating public servants. They must stop coercing public servants to doing the wrong things, to, circumventing laws. And that's how you get your irregular expenditure, for example, where certain laws and regulations are not followed properly because somebody may have asked a deviation from the process so that they can, accrue benefit to some of their associates and so on. So I think it's both, in terms of what needs to be done. Of course, the National School of Government may well want to model itself in future around other similar schools in France, in Singapore and other countries where there's a real demand. If you want to be in the public service, there are certain things that you must develop competence about, because just having a qualification at times does not necessarily mean you know how the state works and the intricacies of the various laws and legislations, including the likes of the Public Finance Management Act, for example, that are at the core of ensuring the governance and of our resources. But then again, having said that, we need to then ask ourselves, in this professionalization of public service, what other laws? Some people, as you all would know, have said that the PFMA is something that we need to look at. Yeah. It has some restrictions that, don't allow the state to function properly. Are we willing to have those conversations as we have this idea of a re-architecture of the public service?
At some point, I'd like to move the conversation to key portfolios and talk to those as we anticipate the announcement of this cabinet. But Professor Ndevu, let's not forget that state-owned companies are under, or should I say state-owned companies and state-owned institutions are under the control of government. So the CEOs, the chairpersons of these SOEs are also going to be critical to look at how easy or difficult a task is that going to be in this arrangement of a GNU?
Oli, I think over the years, what we have done with the state-owned entities or institutions that are supposed to support the work of government is that the institutions have become very weak. The people that have been appointed as institutions are also sometimes found wanting. So one of the things this opportunity presents is that where there are opportunities to appoint people, we need to be able to appoint people that are competent, but to ensure that we also strengthen these institutions. Because we sometimes appoint people that are competent, but the institutional systems and processes pulls them down, don't allow them space to be able to function properly. So this presents an opportunity to be able to do that. But it also presents a very important opportunity to rethink some of these state-owned entities. One, their purpose, their mandate, their mission, and secondly, as to whether we can also reconfigure them. If my calculations are correct, we are sitting at around 700 state-owned entities, and we need to reconfigure that space as well while we look at the leadership issue. I think that's an important consideration, that we need to look at the issue of leadership. And it might be that we need to look at those that their contracts are coming to an end and review them and look as to whether the kind of skills that we require do those skills help those institutions to grow, to deal with the issue of, as other colleagues have engaged in, effectiveness of these institutions in terms of delivery of services, especially critical institutions such as the one delivering on energy, ESCOM, and we'll have to look at Transnet as well around our economic infrastructure, the road flights, as well as whether that is still the trajectory that we want to take, or we want to ensure that we strengthen these institutions to deliver better. So that's one of the things that we have to look at. And also their reporting line as well. We would know that there has been tensions around where these institutions should report, to which ministry they should report to. And I think that should be resolved as well. That should be clarified with the configuration of cabinet. It will help us moving forward to be able to do that.
All right. Professor Fikeni, you're going to come in on key portfolios and what kind of a civil servant or what kind of a public servant do we need in these key portfolios? And you'll help me with which ones are actually considered key, or as the CDE puts it, mission critical. We'll explore those after the break. You're watching News at Prime, and if you're just joining us, we are at the tail end of a discussion around the cabinet, the incoming cabinet. What kind of cabinet do we need? Much of that has been dealt with already, but right now we're trying to deal with what kind of personnel do you need in these departments. Professor Zwelinzima Ndevu, political analyst Lukhona Mnguni, and Professor Somadoda Fikeni are my guests for this conversation. Professor Fikeni, let's come to you. Which government departments are considered critical, and what kind of personnel are needed there?
Well, I do think that the first one should be looking at the ecosystem of human resources, starting with your education departments, because they'll always feed into the system on a sustainable basis. The second one will be those departments that are looking at your public service and administration. And that would include the Public Service Commission, that would include your National School of Government, that would include, of course, the department under which the National School of Government is, the Department of Public Service and Administration, as well as that Department of Monitoring and Evaluation, because those ought to speak to each other.
Yeah.
I do know that the excitement of looking at departments that are looking at ESCOM, at minerals and so forth is always there. But the reality is that if you do not have a capable state, an ethical state, and if you have not, as Lukhona Mnguni was alluding to that, delineated the roles of your political administrative interface, then you'll always have problems, even in those specific areas that we are often excited about because they have higher budget and so forth. So to me, I would say, first and foremost, look at the ecosystem of your human resource development. Look at how you build your public service and administration in general.
Yeah.
And then you come into portfolios such as your finance, of course. And the point was made by Lukhona that if you have Department of Public Enterprise, where all these other public or state companies are hived, how do you relate to departments which are also connected to that? So there would be a need for a rethink, for streamlining of some of these functions so that they are not all over the place. And the positive news is that some of these things are already taking place. For example, the point that Professor Ndevu was speaking to, the consolidation of state-owned companies. Because in some departments like arts and culture, you'll find that you have 28 different entities, when in fact these could be consolidated in a creative way.
Yeah.
The same goes for many other departments. Then you'll have a far more streamlined system that is more focused. So the reform and the rethinking of the architecture of the state will be critical before we even have your cabinet positions in place.
Yeah. Lukhona Mnguni, can I be more specific with you and talk about the police? The people of South Africa are dying, and they're dying at the hands of hired gunmen, some of them who are paid to go and take out so-and-so. And then there is just a general crime. There is a massive problem in the country around that. How do we re-energize this portfolio?
I think, Polly, in the first instance, we need a Minister of Police whom the people within the police service believe that he or she knows what they are doing and what they are there for. Ministries such as police and defense are very difficult ministries to manage because they often work on hierarchy and rank within the department. And if you don't enjoy the respect of generals within those entities, you tend to be displaced quite easily. And if you overly politicize policing, for example, you then fall into the trap of, inefficiencies. I mean, as we saw around the times of Marikana 12 years ago and so on. But I mean, I think we are turning the tide in terms of the appointment of police commissioners, in terms of people who have been within the ranks. There may well be people who are not well placed within the politics of the service itself. But I think you need a minister who's actually going to separate the role of being a functionary within the police service and the role of being a minister. And of course, Polly, you would know that the National Development Plan was very clear in 2012 about some of the reforms that were needed within the police service to demilitarize the police service, to recenter it within society, and to ensure competence, particularly around functions such as public order policing, which also came up out of the Falam Commission report following the Marikana massacre. So I'm trying to say that you need a minister who's going to be single-mindedly focused in terms of implementing reforms, in terms of professionalizing the police, and in terms of ensuring that the people who are within the ranks of the police are actually fit for purpose and who may even be bold enough to encourage the National Commissioner to get rid of some, rogue elements within the police. We know that there are certain rogue elements, even in the highest top leadership structures of the police service in this country, and there has to be a cleanup that needs to be done.
Yeah.
But lastly, Kole, I think there is a cultural reform that is needed within the police service. You will remember during Fees Must Fall, when white students could form human chains around black students because they believed that police would not fire easily at white human bodies as they did to black bodies. That tells you about a cultural question that lingers over our policing and how it sees the different categories of citizens. And if we don't talk honestly about those things and the cultural shifts that are needed within policing, we will not get too far in terms of reformation of our police. So you need a minister who has those nuances and is able to hold tight on a leadership institution that is very much hierarchical and is rank-filled.
That's very profound indeed. Professor Ndevu, depending on how quickly you answer this one, Professor Fikeni will have to, or will be able to get in his last word. In 2020, there was the establishment of Operation Zwelinzima. This was a, you could call it a project management office that was set up in order to accelerate the implementation of reforms that Lukhona Mnguni refers to. Has that worked? Should it be kept?
It has actually not delivered the desired result. There has been progress that has been made in that sense. But I think to add on what Lukhona has indicated is that we also need an integrated justice system where the police system talks to the justice system so that when a person is arrested by the police, that information feeds in immediately to the justice system so that they can start processing that person. And if you have that integrated system, you will be able to deal with some of the deficiencies that we have identified with the Operation Zwelinzima.
Professor Fikeni, last words from you on what this new government of national unity honestly represents for this nation.
It represents a very good opportunity if it is taken seriously to say that all parties are vulnerable and therefore people have expressed their displeasure. The best opportunity to rethink the statecraft, the role of politics, the role of public service, and the role of society. And it is for that reason that we should give impetus to current reforms of the public sector, including professionalization, but also have that consensus-building national dialogue that will produce a blueprint and bring in even those disaffected persons who are no longer participating even in our elections, because we do have in excess of 36, 37 million of eligible voters. Only 27 million are registered and only over 16 million participated. So that particular dialogue will be the one that can bring different sectors of society back into the space of statecraft.
Professor Somadoda Fikeni, I want to thank you very much for your time and accommodating us as you landed in Port Elizabeth. Professor Ndevu, let me thank you very much for your time. Zwelinzima Ndevu is with the Stellenbosch University and a political analyst. Lukhona Mnguni, thank you very much for your contributions.